A Brooklyn mother watched an unspeakable tragedy unfold one morning in May of 2024 when her adult son fatally shot his girlfriend at the family's Midwood apartment. 65-year-old Norma Knight told the New York Post that long-running tensions between 35-year-old Teddy Knight and 29-year-old Tanzia Blockwood erupted into fatal violence at around 10 a.m. during an argument that had kept her up all night. Teddy retrieved a gun from a cupboard and shot Blockwood twice in the head and stomped on her face after she collapsed to the floor. Emergency responders arrived to find both Blockwood and Teddy dead from gunshot wounds. According to Norma, the couple experienced continuous problems over money and paying rent until, in her words, it boiled over. Some neighbors echoed her sentiments, describing the relationship as loud and marked by frequent disagreements. At the same time, they said that the fights never seemed to get violent, leaving the building's residents shocked by the sudden, deadly turn of events. One neighbor described Teddy as disrespectful and said it seemed clear that Blockwood wanted out of the relationship, stating, in his own words, "She did not tell me what was going on, but I could sense something wasn't right." Another neighbor made similar observations, describing Teddy as jealous and possessive, and said that Blockwood stayed for financial reasons while she was finishing nursing school. But the needless tragedy was perhaps best summed up by an older resident of the building who said, "If you cannot be together, you don't have to destroy your lives." Number 19. Rakesh Kamal. From the outside looking in, 57-year-old Rakesh Kamal and his family were living the American dream. They owned a $6.7 million mansion in Dover, Massachusetts, one of the state's wealthiest towns, thanks to Rick's success as an entrepreneur, and they seemed happy. But the Kamals were reportedly in dire financial straits, which appears to be the driving factor behind Rick's decision to murder his wife, 54-year-old Tina, and his 18-year-old daughter, Ariana, in December of 2023. All three family members were found dead from gunshot wounds at their sprawling estate, causing shock and dismay among their friends and relatives who had no idea that anything was going wrong in their lives. In fact, Rick went so far out of his way to conceal his ailing finances that even Tina and Ariana were unaware of their money problems, or the fact that their home had been at the center of foreclosure proceedings for nearly a year leading up to their deaths. Tina believes that she and Rick were doing fine financially and that they were about to buy a second home in Tennessee for $16.5 million. She had even started shopping for furniture for the house, but in reality, Rick had stopped communicating with the real estate agent after making a verbal agreement to buy the home. He never signed the contract, but allowed his wife to believe that the sale was moving forward. In the meantime, Rick borrowed large amounts of money from relatives without telling Tina and failed to repay the loans. Tina's brother, Sandeep Bedi, told the Boston Globe that he had loaned Rick $500,000, but he trusted his brother-in-law and didn't have any idea things were as bad as they were. He said that the Kamal's money problems could have been worked out if Rick had simply been honest with Tina and the rest of the family about the situation, rather than keeping it to himself and needlessly taking his wife and daughter's lives. Number 18. Clarence Cash. Early one morning in December of 2011, 49-year-old retired NYP officer Clarence Cash entered a Manhattan police station and confessed to shooting his wife, 42-year-old criminal investigator Tracy Young. Officers found her dead inside the couple's apartment in Queens with 13 gunshot wounds to the face and torso. A seemingly remorseful Cash reportedly told investigators that Young didn't deserve what he did to her. He explained that he had recently bought his wife a Louis Vuitton bag and that they argued over money because he was struggling to afford Christmas gifts. Neighbors told investigators that they overheard the couple fighting, followed by multiple gunshots. But they said that there had been no other signs of trouble in the relationship leading up to the shooting, and that the couple seemed like nice people. Just hours before her murder, Young had met up with a fellow member of her condo association, who said that she seemed fine and was excited about her new purse. Nearly 3 years after the shooting in late 2014, Cash was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. Number 17. Barton Seltman. On a Tuesday afternoon in November of 2023, 911 dispatchers in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, received a 911 call from 84-year-old Barton Seltman, who reported that his wife of more than 30 years, 85-year-old Margaret, was unresponsive. Responding officers were met by Barton, who was standing on the back porch of his home, covered in blood. Inside the residence, they found the body of Margaret, who had been beaten to death by her husband. Barton told investigators that he and Margaret were fighting over the cost of their pet cat's veterinary care when his wife grabbed a knife and threatened to kill him. Fearing for his safety, he used a chair to push Margaret down onto the floor. He then proceeded to beat and bludgeon Margaret with his fist and a candle holder, even after he no longer saw a knife in her hand. Barton was detained without bail on first and third-degree murder charges. Relatives told Action News that Margaret has suspected that her husband was suffering from dementia due to recent memory problems, including not always knowing where he was. In March of 2024, the court concluded that Barton was incompetent to stand trial and that his mental health cannot be restored to competency, and the case was dropped. Number 16. Courtney Taylor. While responding to a reported shooting at a home in Williamsburg, Kentucky, in January of 2017, deputies forced their way inside and were met by 41-year-old Courtney L. Taylor, who was pointing a gun at them. One of the deputies fired at Taylor twice in order to disarm her, and she was detained while law enforcement began investigating the scene. Inside the home, they found Courtney's husband, 56-year-old Larry Taylor, her 18-year-old daughter, Jessie Taylor, and another teenage daughter, Jolie, shot to death in their beds. Courtney was charged with 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Her arrest shocked residents throughout the area where she worked as a school nurse and until then had been a trusted member of the community. Neighbors also described Larry as a kind man and the couple's daughters as good children. According to detectives, Courtney admitted to killing Larry after he blew through a $264,000 workers' compensation settlement that she had received. She said that the money was specifically meant for her and was deposited into a bank account belonging only to her, but that Larry had nevertheless managed to access the funds and squandered the payout within a matter of months. In a handwritten letter explaining her actions, she stated that she killed her daughters because she didn't want them to grow up without a mother. 3 years after the shooting in February of 2020, Courtney entered an Alford plea to 3 counts of murder, which means that she maintained her innocence, but admitted that prosecutors most likely had a strong enough case to secure a conviction against her. The other charges were dropped as part of a plea deal, and she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Number 15. Adam Vilders and Darla Rodriguez. Shortly after 3 a.m. one morning in July of 2022, police in Littleton, Colorado, responded to a call of shots fired and found 28-year-old Luke Clayton lying on the pavement with gunshot wounds to the chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene, and investigators began working to trace his last movements in an attempt to identify his killer. About an hour and a half before law enforcement was called to the scene, Clayton received a phone call while hanging out with 3 friends at his apartment. He briefly stepped outside and was bleeding from his mouth when he returned. Clayton told his friends that he had been beaten up and tased by 2 women and that he punched one of them. A short while later, the group overheard a loud bang coming from outside and discovered that someone had slashed one of Clayton's truck tires. As Clayton tried getting back into his apartment, a man, later identified as 37-year-old Adam Vilders, ran up to him and tried punching him. The men ended up on the ground as they fought over a gun, which Vilders managed to grab away from his adversary. He shot Clayton twice in the back and reportedly said, "That's what he gets for hitting a woman," then fled the scene with 2 female accomplices. In their attempts to figure out what led up to Clayton's murder, investigators looked at his phone They identified the person who had called him the first time he went outside as 29-year-old Darla Rodriguez. She lived with Vilders, who was her parole sponsor. A week after the shooting, officers tracked Rodriguez's phone to a local residence and conducted surveillance on the property. They watched as Rodriguez and Vilders left in a car together and tried to pull the vehicle over, but the driver drove through a lawn and fled. The suspects eventually ditched the car and were apprehended several hours later. Rodriguez reportedly told police that she and Clayton had fought because he owed her drug money. Vilders admitted to bringing his gun to Clayton's apartment and popping the victim's truck tire in order to lure him outside after he refused to answer the door. Rodriguez, Vilders and a third suspect, 34-year-old Felisa Cruz, were all charged with second-degree murder. In 2023, Rodriguez and Cruz pleaded guilty to a reduced accessory charge and were each sentenced to 8 years in prison. Vilders was found guilty of reckless manslaughter the following year and received a 6-year sentence, with credit for nearly 2 years served. Number 14. Megan Hargan. In July of 2017, a successful 63-year-old business executive named Pamela Hargan and her daughter, 23-year-old Helen Hargan, were found shot to death inside their upscale McLean, Virginia home. Just a short while earlier, Helen had called her boyfriend, Carlos Gutierrez, and told him that her sister, 34-year-old Megan Hargan, had just killed their mother. She stopped answering her phone a short while later, prompting Gutierrez to call 911 and request a welfare check at the home where the bodies were discovered. Megan told investigators that Helen and their mother were arguing when she left the house earlier that day. She claimed that Helen was angry because Pamela had pulled the plug on a contract for the construction of a house for her daughter that she had agreed to pay for. Pamela supposedly disapproved of Helen's relationship with Gutierrez and went back on her word to finance the home after finding out that Helen planned to let him live with her. At first glance, the crime scene appeared to reflect a tragedy involving only Pamela and Helen. Upon taking a closer look, detectives noticed signs that the scene was staged, leading them to believe that a third party was involved. 3 days after the tragedy, a bank employee told the police that someone had tried to fraudulently withdraw $400,000 from Pamela's bank account on the day before and the day of her death. Megan admitted that she had tried to transfer the money to cover the closing costs on a home she was purchasing at the time, but she denied any involvement in her mother and sister's murders. Without enough evidence to charge her, police had no choice but to let her walk free for the time being. In November of 2018, 16 months after the double homicide, Megan was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors accused her of killing the victims because she was jealous that her mother was paying for her sister's house while refusing to help her buy a home. Megan maintained her innocence throughout the trial, but was found guilty on both counts and sentenced to life. In an unexpected twist, she managed to get her conviction thrown out after a juror admitted to doing outside research on the case. Following her retrial in 2023, she was found guilty of the same charges and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Number 13. Cheryl and Reed Sanders. In February of 2020, married couple Robert Reed Sanders and Cheryl Sanders traveled from their home in Leicester, North Carolina to Greene County, Ohio, to confront Cheryl's ex-husband, Robert Lindsay Duncan, amid a long-running financial dispute. The disagreement centered around a trust fund that was meant for Cheryl and Duncan's 2 daughters, which was meant to pay for their college educations. A friend of the Sanders later told the Citizen Times that he begged them not to go to Ohio. He was worried about the situation taking a violent turn and, unfortunately, his prediction was correct. Shortly after the couple arrived at their destination, Duncan dialed 911 and admitted to shooting Cheryl and Reed at his home in Yellow Spring. The Sanders died from multiple gunshot wounds. Duncan claimed that a masked man had ambushed him and his wife Molly and pointed a gun at Molly's head while they were getting their mail. At that point, instinct took over and he did what he felt was necessary to protect him and his wife. Molly told the Citizen Times that Cheryl and Reed did not even try to have a conversation with her and Lindsay before going into attack mode. The problems between the two couples dated back to years earlier, following the acrimonious divorce between Cheryl and Lindsay. A few years before the deadly encounter at the Duncan's mailbox, Lindsay had sued Cheryl and Reed for defamation, slander, and libel. He also accused his ex-wife of extortion. Based on the contentious history between the two families, it probably would have been best for the Sanders not to confront the Duncans in person. Unfortunately, they paid for the decision with their lives, and Duncan was cleared of any wrongdoing after investigators concluded that he acted within his legal right to defend himself. Number 12. Mayor Kasim. As one of the safest communities in the United States, the Chicago suburb of Tinley Park rarely sees violent crime, which is why it was so surprising when police responded to a quadruple homicide at a local residence in January of 2024. Officers arrived at the home early in the morning to find the murdered bodies of 59-year-old Majida Kasim, her 25-year-old twin daughters, Halima and Zahia Kasim, and her youngest daughter, 24-year-old Hanan Kasim. Majida had been shot 7 times, while the other 3 victims had each been shot once. Also present at the scene was Majida's husband and the young women's father, 63-year-old Mayor Kasim, and the couple's 19-year-old son, who was unharmed. Mayor Kasim admitted to being the shooter and surrendered without incident. He explained that he was arguing with one of his daughters about the family's finances, and his wife and other 2 daughters intervened in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. Sadly, the exact opposite happened, and Kasim is now facing 4 counts of first-degree murder. According to investigators, he said he had recently retired after working for 40 years to support his family, and that his wife treated him like a dog. Kasim remains held without bail at the Cook County Jail as he awaits his next court date. Number 11. Daniel Shrewsbury. 33-year-old Daniel Shrewsbury was working as the night shift manager at a Sonic restaurant in San Antonio, Texas, in July of 2024, when he got into an argument with 2 female drive-thru customers who tried paying for their order with counterfeit money. One of the women shot Shrewsbury, who collapsed onto the floor while the suspects fled. He was pronounced dead at the scene, and police released surveillance images of the women along with an appeal to the public for help identifying them. According to the most recent available updates on the case, the suspects have been identified, but it's unclear whether they've been captured. In the meantime, Shrewsbury's family and friends are still trying to come to grips with the death of the man they describe as caring, kind, and hardworking. He was reportedly working to turn his life around when the opportunity to do so was ripped from him without warning, leaving his loved ones devastated and determined to see that justice is served. Number 10. James T. Hams. In February of 2009, 46-year-old James Hams of Lexington, Kentucky, was called to the Cincinnati headquarters of the family-owned Pepsi-Cola bottling company he worked for to be questioned about possible fraud. Until that point, he was a well-respected long-time employee of the company, where he oversaw financial transactions with hundreds of vendors. But there was a lot of money missing, and Hams had shown signs of a lifestyle that was arguably beyond his means, which included scuba diving vacations to the Caribbean. He claimed that he afforded his travels with income from a software company that he had invested in, but he vanished later that day after leaving the interview. Hams's wife seemed genuinely clueless regarding his whereabouts, leading investigators to conclude that he had gone on the run without telling even those closest to him beforehand. In the meantime, the fraud investigation revealed that he had embezzled nearly $9 million from his employer over an 11-year period. The theft began in the late 90s when Hams established a new bank account in the name of an existing vendor that his employer did business with. He deposited large sums of money into the account and then transferred the funds into his personal bank accounts. To avoid getting caught, he falsified records and manipulated those working under him so that no red flags were raised. But the financial discrepancies were eventually discovered, and Hams also fell under suspicion by the IRS for failing to file his taxes. A search of his electronic devices revealed that he had done research on how to disappear, indicating that he never had any plans to stick around and answer for his crimes. Hams remained at large for nearly 6 years before a hiker recognized him on an episode of American Greed in late 2014. The viewer had crossed paths with Hams along the famed Appalachian Trail, which runs for more than 2,000 miles between Maine and Georgia. Known by the trail nickname Bismarck, Hams was well liked among members of the hiking community who had no idea he was a wanted fugitive. He had been hiding in plain sight all along, going completely unnoticed, despite often appearing in social media photos with other hikers. Acting on the viewer's tip, the FBI tracked Hams to Virginia, where he was arrested in 2015 on more than 70 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and other financial crimes. Later that year, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and was ordered to repay all the money he stole. During Hams's time on the run, his wife divorced him. Following his capture, the family of another woman he had previously been married to expressed their suspicions that he had deliberately started a house fire that killed his first wife back in 2003. The fire had been blamed on a faulty electrical cord, but Hams's tendency to lie and deceive caused the family to question whether the incident was truly accidental. Hams has never been charged in connection with the fire, and the matter is considered a closed case. Number 9. Christopher Wright. On a Friday evening in May of 2023, a group of 5 assailants went to the Brooklyn Park, Maryland home of Christopher Wright and beat him mercilessly in his front yard. By the time an ambulance arrived, he was having seizures and clinging to life. He was rushed to the hospital and the suspects fled the scene in an SUV. Wright died from his injuries after undergoing emergency surgery for severe brain trauma. His fiancée, 44-year-old Tracy Karopczynski, told the New York Post that the suspects had come to the home in search of the couple's teenage son, Trenton, who was entangled in a dispute with a fellow student at his high school over $30. Trenton had been beaten up by the group earlier that day, and when Wright realized that the visitors were there to fight, he went outside and said that he was not allowing his son to come out. According to Karopczynski, the unwanted visitors consisted of 3 teens and 2 of their fathers. When Wright refused to let them get to Trenton, one of the men allegedly said that if Trenton wasn't going to fight them, then Wright would have to. An arrest was finally made 2 months later when 26-year-old Trevor Taylor of Glen Burnie was charged with manslaughter, assault, and disorderly conduct. He pleaded guilty to the manslaughter charge in early 2024 and is facing up to 10 years in prison. It's unclear whether authorities plan to pursue charges against any other suspects. Number 8. Lisa Fryhort. In early 2016, 78-year-old Irene Carter was found murdered inside her home in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. Someone had stabbed her 18 times, shoved her down a staircase, and repeatedly bashed her head against the floor. Just in case Carter was still alive, the killer disconnected the landline phone before fleeing the scene in the aftermath of the brutal murder. Carter's adopted daughter, Lisa Fryhort, appeared on national television begging the public to come forward with information that might help lead to the identification and killer of her mother's killer. But this was nothing more than a well-staged act, according to authorities, who connected Fryhort to the crime through a bloody fingerprint and other evidence. Fryhort initially denied any involvement in Carter's murder. Under pressure from interrogators, she eventually admitted that she had killed her mother during an argument over money. In recent years, Fryhort had increasingly taken control of Carter's finances. She eventually obtained power of attorney, giving her complete authority over her mother's money. By the time Carter's home health care aides began to suspect Fryhort of elder abuse, she had squandered a massive amount of the funds on her gambling addiction. The aides filed a complaint and were trying to help Carter regain control over her money when the senior citizen was killed. In June of 2018, Fryhort pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 11 years. Number 7. Brian Easterling. In June of 2022, 63-year-old Michael Evers was found shot to death at his custom auto shop in Pensacola, Florida. The killer had hidden his body beneath a car cover before fleeing the scene in a vehicle. Security footage showed the crime being carried out by Evers' longtime friend, 53-year-old Brian Easterling. Police booked Easterling into custody on suspicion of murder, and he was promptly fired from his position as a local fire chief. An employee at the auto shop told investigators that Evers had told her a friend would be stopping by with some money for him. She said she stood around chatting with both men before finishing her shift and leaving for the evening, and everything seemed fine. After the employee left, Easterling could be seen nervously creeping up behind Evers and shooting him execution style in the back of the head. In the footage, he appeared to be looking around for money before fleeing the scene. Easterling's defense attorney told a slightly different version of events, stating that his client had gone to the shop to collect $25,000 that Evers owed him. The lawyer claimed that Evers was acting evasive and that it made Easterling nervous. Believing that Evers had a gun nearby, Easterling panicked and shot the victim out of a fear for his life. But the video and other evidence spoke for itself, and the jury found Easterling guilty of first-degree murder, which carries an automatic life sentence without parole in the state of Florida. Number 6. Dquaris Jackson. A heated argument between two men in the kitchen of a Lansing, Michigan home took a deadly turn in April of 2017 when 23-year-old Dquaris Jackson shot 30-year-old Wesley Cheeks in the face. Cheeks died from his injuries and Jackson fled the scene. The victim's girlfriend, who was upstairs at the time of the shooting, told investigators that she had overheard bits and pieces about $50 before shots rang out. According to prosecutors, Jackson and Cheeks were members of the same street gang. They were arguing over money that Cheeks owed to Jackson, who was apprehended in Detroit a few days after the murder. The defense claimed that there was no proof that Jackson was even at the crime scene at the time of the shooting, but records show that he was convicted of homicide and 2 gun-related counts. He received a 25 to 50-year prison sentence for the homicide charge and is also serving time for other convictions, including 2 counts of assaulting a prison employee. He'll become eligible for parole in 2048, but could end up spending the rest of his life behind bars. Number 5. James Arthur Macdonald, Jr. Former CNBC financial analyst James Arthur Macdonald Jr. fled the state of California in November 2021 after being summoned to testify before the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding allegations that he had defrauded investors of millions of dollars. The 52-year-old's problems began more than a year earlier when he lost more than $30 million of his clients' money to a risky investment based on his belief that the stock market would experience a massive downturn due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Macdonald was also accused of misrepresenting how his investors' funds would be used, failing to disclose the massive loss from his inaccurate prediction about the stock market, and spending nearly $700,000 of his clients' funds on personal indulgences, including a Porsche, a luxury apartment, and designer clothing. According to federal prosecutors, he sent clients false statements to prevent raising their suspicions, only to later find out that their money was gone. Macdonald managed to evade capture for 3 years and was finally taken into custody in Port Orchard, Washington in June of 2024. He faces 1 count of securities fraud, 1 count of wire fraud, 3 counts of investment advisor fraud, and 2 counts of engaging in monetary transactions in property derived from unlawful activity. Number 4. Angela Stalt. 40-year-old Angela Stalt and 36-year-old part-time limousine driver James Schieffer became friends while living next door to one another in Deltona, Florida. In 2012, Stalt agreed to act as Schieffer's Social Security disability payee as a way to help him better manage his finances. Under the terms of their agreement, Schieffer would pay Stalt $100 per month for her assistant. The arrangement seemed to work out at first, but Schieffer continuously overdrew money from him and Stalt's shared bank account due to his gambling habit, leaving Stalt empty-handed at a time when she had come to rely on the extra income. A few months after the problem began, Schieffer vanished. Because he was behind on rent at the time, his friends and family initially assumed he had skipped town. Due to his financial troubles, police began to suspect foul play several weeks later when a relative of Stalt claimed that she had confessed to murdering Schiefer. Stalt initially denied any involvement in Schiefer's disappearance or knowledge of his whereabouts, but she eventually admitted to killing him. She claims that Schiefer had attacked her at a cemetery one night while they were sitting in her car, and that she stabbed him in the eye with an ice pick and strangled him to death with a cord in self-defense. Once Schiefer was dead, Stalt drove his lifeless body to her house and dismembered his corpse with a hacksaw. She tried to cremate the body parts in her oven the next day, but it didn't work out, so she dumped the burned remains in various locations throughout Volusia County. After confessing to the crime, she took police to the places where she had discarded the body. During Stalt's trial for Schiefer's murder, prosecutors challenged her self-defense claim, arguing that she killed the victim because she was angry about his overspending. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and is serving life without parole. Number 3. Elizabeth Hawes and Andrew Hawes. 46-year-old Edwin Hawes was reported missing in Andover, Wisconsin, in 2008 after his roommate came home to find his car missing and a large pool of blood in the driveway. Responding deputies immediately noticed that the scene smelled like bleach, indicating that efforts had been made to clean or conceal evidence of a crime. They found a crossbow, hammers, and a baseball bat strategically hidden on the property, as if someone had stashed the items with plans to use them at a later time. Investigators learned that Edwin was entangled in a long-standing financial dispute with his siblings, Elizabeth and Andrew Hawes, who had accused him of skimming funds from a family business and pocketing $600,000 from the sale of their grandmother's stocks. Edwin obtained orders of protection against his siblings, but tensions continued to escalate. At one point prior to Edwin's disappearance, Andrew had been arrested for trying to run him off the road. Shortly after Edwin went missing, police spotted Andrew and Elizabeth sitting in a parking lot near his home. They returned to the parking lot later that day and found a similar crossbow to the one found at Edwin's house, along with a container of bleach and blood-stained rubber gloves. After failing to find any trace of Edwin in the immediate area, investigators contacted law enforcement roughly 200 miles away in Cottonwood County, where Andrew's girlfriend had a farm. Police paid a visit to the property and arrived while Edwin's remains were being burned. In the meantime, Edwin's car was found abandoned outside a church with a bloody sledgehammer in the trunk. Based on the evidence, detectives concluded that Andrew and Elizabeth had beaten their brother, shot him with a crossbow, and either ran him over or dragged him with a car before setting his body on fire. They were both found guilty of first-degree murder and are serving life without parole. Today's topic was requested by Stephanie McCord 6100 and Chris Brown Lexicus. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comment section below. Number 2. Brandon Carlos Grant. A petty dispute between roommates over $1 escalated into deadly violence in April of 2024, when officers responded to a complaint about a fight at a Miami apartment building and found 36-year-old Brandon Carlos Grant laying on the sidewalk. He had blood on his hoodie and claimed he couldn't breathe as he asked the police for water, but was able to tell the police which apartment he lived in. Inside the unit, officers found Grant's roommate dead with blunt force injuries to his face. Grant reportedly told investigators that they were laying in their beds in the same room when he became angry with his roommate for refusing to give him $1. He was arrested on suspicion of second-degree murder and remains held without bond while awaiting trial. Number 1. Jay Wilson. The relationship between June Wilson and her 45-year-old son, Jay Wilson, became strained during a dispute over money and property. In June of 2022, they made plans to discuss their issues at June's home in Woodstock, New York. June's friend, 67-year-old Dita Seah, accompanied her to the meeting for moral support. It's unclear exactly what happened, but the discussion quickly went sour, and Jay shot Seah, killing him in June's driveway. Terrified for her life, June ran and took refuge at a neighbor's house. The first officer to arrive at the scene, Sergeant Joseph Saunson, was attempting to render first aid to Seah when Jay appeared in the doorway and opened fire on him. He was grazed by the bullet but was thankfully okay otherwise. Jay remained barricaded inside the house for the next several hours while police put the neighborhood on lockdown and surrounded the property. Residents were ordered to stay inside their homes as heavy-duty tactical vehicles filled the street. Law enforcement worked to obtain a warrant to enter the home while officers at the scene tried to negotiate Jay's surrender. When they finally went inside, they found Jay dead from a bullet wound. In the aftermath of the chaos, local realtor Laird Bradley told VT Digger that June owned the house Jay was living in and planned to sell it. She offered to let her son live in another house she owned, and he seemed okay with the plan. According to Bradley, neighbors were equally shocked by the senseless tragedy, especially because they had always known Jay to be pleasant and polite, and far from the type to commit such a horrific act of violence. Thanks for watching. If you knew for certain that your best friend stole $10 from you and they refused to admit it, would you forgive them or cut ties with them forever? Let us know in the comments section below.